DevOps microcontainers. And I'm very pleased to announce that we have all the way from Belgium the founder of the DevOps movement, Patrick Dubois from Zender TV. He's the CEO of Zender TV. Patrick? Hey, thanks for coming all the way out here for this.
Thanks for having me. Right. Where's my slides? OK. So no product announcements from me. OK. I have 95 slides, so I'm going to pick up the pace. From serverless to serviceful. OK. There's a lot of things I did. Most people might know me from starting with the word DevOps and making it a thing around the world. I do a lot of conferences, and whenever I see a new thing, I just start to get people together. So that's what I'm most proud of. Currently, I'm working in a startup, and we basically do a white label version similar to Facebook Live and Periscope for people who cannot go on the socials. So hit me up if you want to talk about that, but that's about it for me. OK, small startup, 7 people, and we're running things. How do we do that? Easy. We use services. Backend services, community services, IT support services. So you're starting to see a pattern. Office services, front-end services. So it's hardly that we do anything ourselves, but still, we do. Mobile services? Yes, I am. So we figured that using all those services is probably smarter than building these things ourselves. It's a principle we follow in our company because we want to focus on our function in our domain. We're not the only ones doing it. Even the big companies are doing it. Like Snapchat is using Google, PubNub and Woza, Periscope. So it's not something as only a startup would do. Like even the big boys would do that. OK. This brings me to the difference between serverless and serviceful, which I mentioned. I think the fact that we're using so many different services is, for me, the essence of serverless. Some would argue it's about the hardware not running on servers, but it's actually using, and the keyword there is third parties or vendors to do parts of your work, and they're more efficient or better to do so. So about 2 years back, we started using serverless stuff. So who's familiar with serverless? Raise your hand. OK. For those who aren't, it's basically the next step from virtual machines, containers, and now you only deploy functions, one function at a time on your service. So there's a couple of them. I heard that Oracle released their own now, so I should have added that, but I was too late for the slides. OK, so we use all those services, but it hasn't been always that easy for us. First time we used Lambda, we said, OK, it's great, and we built a meme generator for one of our customers. And when it got up into production, we got errors about disk full. Like, what? I'm running Lambda functions. I'm getting errors like disk full. So apparently, the disk gets reused, and there's a limit, which is obviously in the documentation, but something we hit. Then there's the other thing. We fought so hard about getting very fast performance, and then we looked at part of the API on the serverless, and there were these cold starts. Because underneath, it's still a machine, and it has to start up. And if it's idle for a while, it takes some time. So there's a delay. The other thing we noticed that, so we're updating our versions of functions, but sometimes the old version would be stuck, and we would still see the API responding with older versions, even though it was all deployed. But the swap from the old version to the new version only happened when the container was kind of becoming idle. So under full stress, we had the issue that the swap didn't happen to the new version. There's a lot of pain points in serverless, and when you look at the topics, it's monitoring, debugging, testing, latency, deployment, and so on, which is funny because it should have taken all that pain away. And when you ask people in serverless, what's your problem? It's all those ops topics that they want to make you go away, but you hit them again. And, I could say it's the problem with serverless, but in reality, it's any service we use. Like, who's get some time or coffee taken while GitHub was down? Me? Okay, only a few. NPM, whether it's Maven or whatever is down, it doesn't really matter. You get coffee, you hit the limit, and you feel like, oh well, I'm responsible and I'm not responsible. I can't do anything about it. But we got blocked for our email because Amazon. It's really annoying. We learned the hard way that for the type of live events we do, the load balancer couldn't scale fast enough, so we have to kind of ask Amazon to pre-warm the service. So all these things you just learn by using the services. They don't really tell you that up front. So it's kind of like a discovery cycle you go through. And if it's really bad, it happens. Sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's not okay. Those are the worst issues, because you really can't do anything about it. And you have to really wait for the supplier of your services to fix things in order. So, yes, we don't have the maintenance of running all the software and all the things behind it, but in reality, what we're actually doing is increasing the risk of availability. Does that resonate with you? Who uses a lot of external services? Raise your hand. Okay, a few. All the others are still building it themselves. Congratulations. I hope you move as fast as your competitor and you can keep up with the pace. So all this reasoning about these dependencies reminded me of promise theory, championed a lot by my friend Mark Burgers. And I'm going to explain a little bit of the principles and see how that gets you about your reason about external services. So in the ecosystem that you're working in, you are what they call an agent. Okay, yeah, I need to click faster. So, and you make promises to others in the system. So whatever service you provide, it's a promise. Don't mistake promise with like a hard SLA. So things can go down. I'll get to that later. It's a promise. Okay, somebody should be able to check your service, like maybe have a status page, whether you're up, whether it works or not. Basically, verifiable. So a promise doesn't guarantee the outcome. It's only a promise. I'll do my best. It's my intent to keep up the service. There's no way in hell I can guarantee 100% uptime, no matter who tells you that they want that. It's always a guarantee. That's the difference between the old way of thinking. Nothing can go down, so we build the ultimate cluster of whatever. No. The new reasoning is things go down, and we need to get better at dealing with that stuff. So there's an important difference, a promise and not a guarantee. Of course, there can be conditions. Like if I put the load on the system, I can say, well, this is the load I can handle. Beyond that load, you're on your own. So I will put in conditions on the promise I give to agents in my ecosystem. And when I do so, I want to have that documented. Like Amazon documented the disk space issue, which I should have read, but I found out later. But the promise was that it's that amount of disk space, this is the number of limits you have, clearly stated as a promise. The language of the promise must be shared. I don't know if you've used a lot of Amazon services, but they typically are very API-centric, but not very human-friendly in their API. So there's always like a layer of translation between it to make it really usable. Although all the APIs are there, but it always needs kind of like a translation to make it easier to work with. And you need to agree on the promise you make. Like, it has to be with consent. I cannot overload the system and I say, you didn't keep your promise. No, this is how we deal with each other in the ecosystem. So, of course, an agent depends on other agents, and they have to keep their promise, but still, you have to realize it's a promise. It's not a guaranteed thing. They make the promise to you as well. And of course, they need to be verifiable, documented, and mutually agree. It sounds like a basic thing, but in many cases, it's hard to verify, it's hard to not document it, and it might not be guaranteed. You're just going to hammer the system and say, well, it's not working. Yeah, but we never agreed that this was the load you're going to put there. It was never completely documented that you're going to use this API call, all that stuff. So you cannot make promises on behalf of the other agents. You can only make the promise on your own part. So if you would make a promise on behalf of the others, it's beyond your control. It's something in promise theory that doesn't work that way. And sometimes those promises can be conflicting. Let's say I'm using Node.js. Okay, sorry, it's the Java conference. I'm using Java. And Amazon has certain versions that it runs on the serverless. And I really want to have a new version. And they can pull the old version. So in their interest for maintenance, they're just going to pull the old version. But you need the new version. So you will have a conflict like, hey, but you were running and providing the service, and we're going to switch the version. So this type of conflicts, you just have to assume in the system. But the conflict cannot be exposed from your service. It's probably inside your own services that you use, but you have to deal with it. So it's not something you should just expose to the outside world. And so what's important to keep a promise is that you have the notion of choice. Because if I don't have a choice, how am I going to keep my promise? If one of the agents in the system fails, I cannot guarantee, or I'm not guaranteeing, but it's very hard to keep my promise. And sometimes those services get into a bigger agent. Let's say a cloud vendor, a service vendor. They say, well, all the similar things get grouped. But the agent then becomes the new single point of failure. Like, what if Amazon's down? What if Lambda is down? What if Azure is down? It's still a new single point of failure. So We thought we handled it by not having to deal with redundant hard drives. Now we have to deal with redundant clouds. So we're back to square one, but it's the same principle. You ultimately need the choice to go from 8 to 1 to avoid the single point of failure that you're using in the services. Because they will never go down, those services. Something that will never happen. So one of the jobs you have by using all those services is that you eliminate the single point of failures. In serverless, that could be like, okay, we could use Azure, Google Functions or whatever and switch between those, but you can also run it yourself. There's nothing like, it's a valid approach of dealing with the single point of failure. OpenFiles is like a Docker solution for running the functions. You can run it on your Kubernetes, right? You could just run it on premise. It doesn't have to be in the cloud. It's having the alternative, having the choice. So to keep your promise, you can just switch between the different systems. That's when you're using services. That's the way you reason about like dealing with all the agents in your ecosystem. Serverless framework is one important aspect. They're trying to be provider agnostic. Why? To keep that choice. So these are just a few examples on how you would deal with that. These are specific serverless examples, but it doesn't really matter. It could be for your CDN, it could be for your transcoding, it could be for anything that you're using as a service. Like, what if your Google Docs go down? How would that hurt you? Do you have a backup or not? So all these kind of things is like, they're beyond your control, but you're ultimately responsible for your promise, so you have to deal with all these different systems. Sometimes they give you an alternative worldview, those agents, saying like this is API version 1, 2, 3. That's how they shift by being able to move faster and faster for different versions. And the other thing to consider, if you're using a super agent, so a cluster of a lot of different services, the bigger the agent gets, often the slower it gets as well for change. So there's definitely like a case to be made for smaller players and the big players, like the supermarket on the corner and the big supermarket. It's like being able to switch feature from one to the other and have the steady pace as well. Because it's really hard when you scale your system to keep your promise. Like the promise of the performance that I mentioned, like the API requests. Like imagine, okay, I could probably guarantee performance across 20 nodes, but what if I scale that to hundreds and hundreds of nodes that have to go all the time? The problem just gets bigger and bigger. And in promise theory, what they say is that like a promise that you make is actually build a relationship. And I think that's one of the key things they say, is building a relationship. I'll come back to that later. So up until now, we talked a little bit of theory, promise theory. We talked about the different serverless things. And so I argued really hard over all these years to get dev and ops to work together in the same room and so on. But the problem with all these external services is that I cannot sit down with, these services because they're somewhere else. They're beyond my control. They might have different approaches to the world. They might have a different roadmap. I cannot control that. So that's what's kind of my aha moment in there. So how are we going to solve that? So sure, we put some technology on there, and that makes it a lot easier, but I don't think that's really the answer there. In a poll I did on Twitter, I asked, like, what's the hard part? You know, and surprise, surprise, it wasn't the technology. It was the people that we needed to take care of. And that one was interesting in why not serverless. He said, like, you can hug servers. No, you can hug people, right? Even though, you know, we all had our moments with the pet names for all the servers and so on. I hope we were past that, but, you know, it's the human touch that we're looking for in this. I know it's really hard at a conference where it's all tools and, you know, chatbots and communication, but I never heard about the real communication between the real people. Kind of makes it interesting. Somebody call it an emotional API. We need to start developing. Somebody said, like, DevOps, it's the thing of the past. So the good thing is I do not have any shares invested in any DevOps companies. I do not make my living for DevOps, so whatever. So we build on new IDs. It's going to be a next new ID. The only thing I hope is that part of the ID is just going to live on in the next ID, and it will be still a cultural change of working things together. Whatever the name, whatever the new thing comes up, for me, that's fine. So I started seeing how we interacted with all these different external services and relying on them. And then I realized it is DevOps. Okay, I might be biased because, you know, I started with the term and I see DevOps maybe everywhere, even with my kids or whatever, but I still think it's DevOps. And you see these practices emerging in a way in the field. Like, we used to communicate this status page inside our own company, and now we are putting it outside. Like, this is the #1 lesson learned from the first big outage on Amazon. They didn't have a status page, and they were just swamped with everybody asking, what's happening? Why is it down? What's happening? And so this is a simple way of communicating your status outwards of your own company. Just exposing your metrics, like whatever happens inside, to somebody's using your services is very helpful, because when he needs to debug, he can see what's happening underneath. I think that one is really interesting. Is, you know, in the bottom right corner, it says severe render errors, which is a totally internal thing of that provider, and a lot of the vendors would just shy away of showing severe render errors in their graphs, but they're very brave, and they give you an insight on communicating how things are happening, so you can deal with your promise to make sure what they're happening, that you're able to shift somewhere else. And they're not saying, like, it's the green everywhere. They really tell you what's going wrong. Just updating people during that phase, it's communication. Your tool can say it's up and down, but the nice communication that somebody gets going and says, like, we're handling it, it's really nice, whether that's through email or any other means. The fact that you can get data out of your service, a really important part. Like, something I look for when I use a service, it's easy to get my data into your service, but how can I get the information back out? Simple things. Error definitions, making it clear what happens. I mentioned that before, having an API to back up the data. Like, I've searched, but a lot of the services, it's really hard to reproduce your settings. Like, what if your account is wiped? How do you reconfigure your service? A lot of them just don't allow you to take a full dump and then load back all your settings. You know, you've clicked through the whole API thing, but it's really hard to get the backup and going again. Obviously, there's a Slack slide, and not because they're Slack. It's because they're doing an awesome job at when problems occur, they communicate about it in a very nice human fashion instead of just saying with a chatbot we're available, we're not available. Somebody's really typing, hey, well, how was your day? What are you doing? This is really communicating outside your company. The postmortems, another brave thing a lot of companies are doing. If you had a real failure, man up to describe what actually happened. Don't try to put it somewhere in a dark corner and not explain what happened. These are very insightful, and for me, they get bonus points when they do these kind of things for choosing them as a service. So it's kind of like in my checkbox if a company does that or not. So even proactive, like your server is degraded, it will go down. Really interesting to get that information as well. It's simple things like a change log of what happened. Simple communicating stuff. And you might say it's trivial and we all do that, but there's lots and lots of services that do not have this kind of communication outward. Just even talking at conferences, I learn a lot about internals of a company when I listen to people speak about their products and so on. It's the willingness to share, like I look at the open source stuff people are doing or how they document things, little cues for that. Some even have their roadmap on there where you can influence and say, this is probably the next interesting feature. Remember the different, the alignment of different promises we make. This is a way to realign and communicate like, hey, this is something we want. This is something that's interesting to us. In all these cases, it's not that I'm actually talking from engineer to engineer, but there is a communication going. Like Fabric, another one, they just listen in on conversations on Twitter. They pick you up. Oh, you're having a problem. I'm going to help you. This is the kind of type of communication I would be looking for. Open sourcing stuff. What I definitely don't want to see is like 16 days to get a response from you. It's like my biggest nightmare is Apple at the moment for these kind of stuff. When I use a new service, I send them a gist about the feedback on what I came across. And the interesting feedback I get from the engineers is that we've used your gist to go to our engineering department and say, this is something that happened, something we should fix. But we had a really hard time convincing them ourselves internally, but because you logged it, we could take that to them. Simple thing, communicating, feedback, and they love it. It's just, how would they know? Obviously, they would see like, oh, you stopped using our service, but this is valuable feedback. I would expect that for my own service as well, to get that feedback, to get better. even getting direct contact with the engineers. Like, how valuable is that? Not having to file a ticket, wait till somebody respond, but just hop on a channel, engineer to engineer, be able to discuss these things. Okay, they're not sitting next to me, but at least I have an unfiltered, bidirectional conversation with them about my problems. So for me, if you say DevOps, we've been so focused on solving the problem inside our own company. I think now we have to look at how we collaborate across companies with DevOps. It's even going to be harder because we can't, control the other one. So we should be like equals at the table and kind of help that. But to me, that's going to be the next step for DevOps. So the collaboration, not only inside your company, extended to the third parties. Think about promises and know that others are allowed to fail with their promises, and it's your job to keep your promise by going around that others are able to fail. Being able to verify that. And I think to keep your promise to the business, because that's ultimately what we're doing, is that whatever technology and communicating, we're still trying to make the business and the users to keep that. And there's probably a lot of technology people here, but if you think about the CTO, whatever he decides is actually a business decision. So it's not about like, hey, let's use a chatbot. No. The goal is to communicate better, and then for that we might use something as a chatbot or do that. But the goal is not to use a chatbot as such. And that means that to engineer, it's not only about your technology, it's way more. And I encourage you to just take that leap of faith and start communicating with the others in various ways, and not just be focused on the APIs and the technology that you're using. I'm always there. There's a couple of books. The slide's going to be available soon. So obviously, Promise Theory, it's a little bit like heavy, but it's a very interesting read. Serverless in general, there's a good book, and there's a good GitHub that lists a lot of the resources that you want to read about. Sure, on DevOps, many books, but here are a few. The right one on is even a graphic novel. Interested, fun reading on the goal and doing that. And then I have another set of books because I believe somehow we need to figure out a way that we're always repeating the same issue, which is we fall into the technology trap or the religion that technology is going to solve all our problems. And these are a few interesting books that will get you some ideas and show you how our reasoning is influenced, that we believe technology will do the difference, but might also create some downsides that we start being blind about because we are so religious about technology, and whether that's in politics or whatever. Interesting set of books there. And this is my last slide. I thought it was only fitting at an Oracle conference. Like whatever we do in the compute and the serverless, it doesn't really matter because it's going to be where your data is, and that's probably where all the rest is going to build around it. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks so much, Patrick. Really appreciate you coming out here for the conference.
Thank you.
So how have you been enjoying Oracle Code? You were in the exhibition hall earlier and did an interview. So what's your impression?
Yeah, there's so much that's happening there. Somebody asked me, like, are you still using Java? I said, like, I'm using it for my banking software. But it's been interesting that all these ideas just keeping expanded. I really like the idea of the multiple languages, the polyglot, more seamless operations. So that's
Cool.
a good thing. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
So, Stephen, please share.
So we'd like you guys to continue engaging with us on different social channels. You can follow the @OracleDevs Twitter handle, where all the tweets are going out. We were live streaming the presentations today on both YouTube and Facebook. So either the Oracle Devs YouTube or the Oracle Devs Facebook channel. And we're engaging with community folks to put content on Medium. So if you are a person interested in publishing, give Bruno and I content, and we'd be happy to publish it on Medium. I see people shaking their heads. We need an article. And if you aren't, but you want to watch some of the content, just follow the Oracle Devs Medium account, and we'll make sure there's lots of great content coming in. So I think we have something to give out, Bruno?
We got some sweaters over here, some hoodies.
Yeah, this is like an Oracle Code tradition.
It's an Oracle Code tradition. It used to be T-shirts. We improved. All right, so who wants a hoodie? All right, I'll try over here one. All right. And one over there.
All right, and I'm gonna give you an easy one.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.